My name is Cynthia Green. I'm the mother of Joel and Amy Grossman, and I was born in 1923 in June, and I'm living in Berkeley, California at present. We're in my main room and in my house, and I wanted to talk about my family and where we all came from. And I could start with people that you already know, like my mother, Peggy, and but I think I'll start further back because the two important people in the family, as far as our heritage and my knowing them, etc., was really my grandmother and grandfather. My grandfather was John Eliot Oldham, and he lived in Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts. He was an investment banker and a catcher. And
a catcher?
Yeah, well,
catcher for money in the bank?
No, a catcher for baseball. I mean, he and a friend were selling books or doing something or other, and they were going Maine. They went all the way down to Machias, which is the end of Maine. And as they were coming back, they stopped by a place where people were playing baseball. And they stopped and watched, and then someone said, we don't know what to do. We don't have a catcher. And they looked at Grandfather and they said, "Can you catch?" And his friend said, "Can a duck swim?" And he played the game and he won. But so Massimo's being a catcher,
is in a long line.
Seems the appropriate thing. Well, anyway, that was my grandfather, John Oldham, and I'm going to start about his family, but I'll tie them together a little bit first. He married Harriet Holden, and her family did not come over on the Mayflower as her fathers did, but they had some interesting stories, and among them Benjamin Holden, who was he was a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and the musket that you have, Joel, is probably his, as far as we know it is. And the main thing is that we have various records of his having been in the war. I mean, ordnance things, he'd sign for so many somethings for his troops and so forth. Anyway, the war was over and they won the war, and he was properly honored in Princeton, Mass. by the church there. They gave him Pew 76.
This was where?
Princeton, Mass, a little tiny town in the middle of Massachusetts. But 76, of course, was the year of the Revolution. So
this was a great honor.
Yes. But what I like about this story is that we live now, we don't really know anything about him, but we do know that he would come stumbling into church a little bit drunk on Sunday nights. 76. And they said, where in the hell is Pew 76?
Yeah.
And that's all we have, but it makes a reality out of this whole thing about all these people that you look at pictures of and you hear a few little stories of.
So his name was?
His name was Benjamin Holden.
And this was your grandmother's
and
ancestor.
My grandmother's ancestor. And your ancestor, your Joel Holden, was you were his namesake. And this was, I think, Joel Holden. But you're named after Joel Holden Jr. Joel Holden Sr.'s father, I think, was Benjamin Holden.
I see.
And we have no photograph of him. But anyway, this is not the family I'm going to talk about now. First, I'm going to talk about the Oldhams. But they both, John and Harriet Oldham, had one child, and that was Margret Anna Oldham.
Also known as Peggy.
Only known as Peggy once she left home. I think her parents insisted on calling her Margret, so and of course, she has a great granddaughter named
Maggie.
Margret, who is known as Maggie, spelt like Peggy, that is with a Y on the end instead of an IE, so that keeps it in the same frame. All right, that's just, so these are all people that Peggy Green, as she became, was descended from. And I'm going to take the first half, which is John Oldham's family.
Okay. Shall we get some photos out?
Yeah. These are the parents of John Eliot Oldham, my grandfather, who was born in 1866. Well, this is just before their wedding. He was 21 years old, and she was 18. That was Margret Bearse Oldham. This man was a very devout Christian, extraordinarily. He came from the family came over for religious persecution reasons, and they were Christians, Protestants that is, and they settled on the Cape, Massachusetts, and they went to Congregational Church, which was apparently the church that people went to who came over at that time. And it seems that most of the things that he said, did, wrote, whatever, were infused with a kind of Christian attitude, and things were very serious with him. And he certainly brought his children up to be very upright.
This was your grandfather's father?
My grandfather's father. Now, they're all named John Oldham. The last John Oldham was my grandfather. After that, he had only a daughter, and so the name died out. But the first son, every generation was named John Oldham. So
how many of them were there?
Well, I don't really know. And they didn't come over with the Pilgrims, but they came over soon after, 20 years or so afterwards. But we have them going back into England a few generations. And there was a minor poet in England, well known, however, named John Oldham. And there's always been a family tradition, since the first son was always John Oldham, that it came from them, but we don't really know that. But it's a thing that we like to assume.
Yeah.
Okay, John Oldham came over, and he started trading with the Indians almost at once. And he made very good friends of Indians.
This was the early, this was not the John Oldham we're looking at right now.
No.
And this early one would have been over in the 1600s sometime. Is that right?
Yes. He probably came 40 or somewhere.
Into Massachusetts.
Into Massachusetts colony. He was very important, and at one point, the city of Watertown, where I'm not sure what his connection to Watertown was, but they wanted to put up a statue of him, giving fish to the Indians, trading with them. But they wanted some money to do it. They didn't have the money, and my grandfather felt there was just something. My grandfather was so particular about things, but he would never pay a penny to get advertising of any sort, and he didn't do it. So they asked the Saltonstalls, and the Saltonstalls came up with the money. So there is a statue in Watertown of an early Saltonstall, but it could have been John Oldham. But I think there is some kind of memorial or plaque. I've never been able to find it, but something about John Oldham in Watertown, Mass. Maybe someone will look it up. Anyway, that was just the first one. Every generation, there are these taciturn old men named John Oldham, incredible, and they were almost all of them ship's carpenters. I think this John Oldham, John Wesley Oldham, they were all named after ministers. See, John Wesley, I guess, was a Christian Protestant minister, and John Eliot was, so my grandfather was, but it didn't take with him, and he never went to church at all. But up until then, it was a very deep feeling about the proper thing to do, and that was to be a Christian. And this man was quite unusual. He didn't have a lot of education. He was a self-taught engineer. He was so good, he constructed 2 lighthouses in Massachusetts off Cape Ann. They were called Ann's Eyes. He also was hired by the Haitian government to build something important for them there. Now, this may turn up in the papers when I get going over the genealogy thing, so we'll know. This is the man we're looking at right now. I never knew him. He was my grandfather's father. He was my great-grandfather. Mm-hmm. And both he and my great-grandmother had died by the time I was born. I guess the only great-grandparent I had on my mother's side was my grandmother's mother that I had actually seen. All the others had just died. But he seems to have been a very interesting man. He wrote a lot of stories. I think we'll find papers of his,
sure.
Handwritten, longhand, for the family, and just for his own records. Anyway, he brought my grandfather up to be a very upright, scrupulous man. And as I may have told you, this story, which I think in one short way sums up John Eliot Oldham, my grandfather. It was the time of the crash in 1929 in the United States. And my grandfather had been an investment banker. He was working with J. Pierpont Morgan in his firm. And he was a trustee of something called the Atlantic Bank, which I believe was in New Jersey. And the bank crashed, like a lot of others. My grandfather was only an honorary trustee. He never attended a meeting. He knew nothing about it. But when all the money was gone, theoretically, the trustees of the bank had to come up with it. My grandfather spent the next 20 years paying it off. He paid entirely his share of it, even though he had never participated. And I don't think that was an accident. It's really hard to believe anybody would do something like that today. But I think it had a lot to do with John Wesley Oldham we're looking at here, and the family that he came from, and this need they had to be terribly correct, terribly scrupulous about all their dealings. Well, I'll give you another example. We're still talking about my grandfather, not my great-grandfather. We were playing bridge one evening, my grandfather and I and two women at Squirrel Island. And I had something in my hand that was a little mysterious. And I played something not in a traditional way, but in a way that allowed the other people to think that I had something that I didn't have. And so the other side was counting on it, and they led to that and so forth. Now, this can be done in correct ways in bridge. What I did was not correct. I don't remember the details of it at all. But my grandfather was ready to stop playing altogether. He was so shocked that I would try to fake something as a joke. Didn't matter. I mean, this was not what you did. And I grew up in this background, so although I wasn't brought up a Christian, there were a lot of things that came out of the Christian tradition that were very much part of my upbringing. And just a slight look of disapproval from my grandfather would tell me what was right and what was wrong.